Last episode, we explained Britain's love of the old school big bore revolver. But that does not mean that they never tried an auto-loading handgun. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a pistol, self-loading, 4.55 Mark 1 N as in naval. This is the Webley self-loader. And even though I think you can see it from space, let's go ahead and take a look in the light box. With an overall length of 8.5 inches and weighing in at 2.5 pounds, this is actually fairly comparable to the previous revolvers. It feeds the 4.55 self-loading semi-rimless cartridge from a magazine that fits 7 rounds. Now, while this will be Britain's first fully adopted automatic pistol, it doesn't mean it was their first experiment with one. And so I'm going to set this down and we're going to do a little history lesson. This is the Mars Automatic, designed by one Hugh Gabbett Fairfax. He had worked on this design from about 1895 and kept updating it all the way to 1900. But getting out of prototype and into production was beyond a single man. So he signed an exclusive license with Webley and Scott, who would help finish the development. For that, they had their own man, William Whiting. Born in Darlaston, his father had been a gunlock filer who would wind up working for Philip Webley. At around the age of 12, young William would become a fetch and carry boy at the Webley factory, and would later apprentice under the owners directly. He rose to workshop foreman of the revolver department in 1889, likely thanks to his involvement in developing the service revolver we saw last episode. Along with his friend John Carter, Whiting would make a number of small improvements that advanced the marks in that particular design. This work meant that when his father passed in 1893, he would assume his role as the works manager. And so, with this incremental development experience, he was tasked to make the Mars a reality. Now, the Mars would be probably the most powerful handgun in the world for a few decades. But that doesn't mean that it was fit for military service. As a matter of fact, if you had to sort of sum up the total experience that was the Mars, the financial success or the promise of it kind of comes along to, it's really cool, but it goes almost nowhere. It's more of a proof, well, an attempted proof of concept. But it did one thing very well, and that one thing was that it trained up William Whiting in order to rapidly and logically advance an auto-loading handgun. And he would apply it again in a slightly more successful design before we even get to this. This time the patent was provided by one G. Vincent Fosbury, who had taken a Colt 1876 single-action revolver and converted it to an automatic reciprocating design. In 1899, he brought the design to Webley because his prototypes were proving a bit too fragile. Again, William Whiting was tasked with making it work, this time on a Webley revolver frame. I'm sure quite a few of you recognize that gun. And yes, while commercially viable, I wouldn't call it a definite market dominator, and it did not get official military adoption due to some weaknesses in its potential for dealing with sand and muck, and it's a bit complicated, okay? So if the British government is not going to adopt a automatic revolver, is there any automatic that they will adopt? Like, what would it take to make the British military pay attention to an auto-loading handgun? And the shortest possible answer to that is probably about the same thing that it took for the US government to look at an automatic handgun. They wanted stopping power. They wanted a gun built around the concept of one shot to the center of mass means one dead hombre. That is a lot to ask from autoloaders at the time because they were mostly geared towards smaller calibers and the parts weren't really as tough. And look, it's difficult to move a big, slow bullet in an autoloading format at that time. They were not nearly as efficient as they are today. So having these dedicated cartridges that were dialed into the size of the system, and by the way, in such a way that you didn't end up with this grossly overbolt gun, that was important. But still, would Britain at least give us a list? Would it at least say what they absolutely had to have? And yes, By May of 1903, the Small Arms Committee did have that list. They required a gun with a locking breech that would be as reliable as the current service revolver. Ooh. They demanded the greatest possible wounding power, which means a velocity no greater than 1,200 feet per second and a diameter of not less than 0.4 inch. Accuracy must be as good as the current revolver. It must have a manual safety catch operatable by one hand. It must be quick to reload. It must be compact with few projections to snag. It must be as light as possible and hopefully no heavier than the current revolver. It should be durable and easily disassembled, have a minimum of 6 cartridges. The breech should remain open after the last shot was fired. It should be sighted for 25 yards, and the trigger pull should be about 6 to 8 pounds. Now, by today's standards, that seems like a simple enough list, but back then, 1903, guys, don't forget the 1911 is still quite a ways away at that point. Think of what Colt's working with at that time, and they are top of the line. So Webley, who doesn't have their own native design, they got nothing, right? Compounded into that, like the worst possible addition to that list is the fact that the British Small Arms Committee also had, not on paper, but no real interest in jacketed ammo. They liked the effect of lead ammunition because it still mushroomed but didn't violate Hague Convention. Jacketed ammo? Piercing somebody? Oh, no interest in that. If we can't have our dum-dums, then we definitely want to have this soft lead bullet. And that means extra gumming of any automatic action that you put in the field. Lead gathers everywhere. Jacketed ammo is really good for automatic firearms. Still, with all that against them, William Whiting over at Webley decided that he was going to take a crack at this nut. He began with a patent in 1903 and borrowed from his experience with the Mars for sure, but this still displays plenty of novel concepts. Overall, it is a hammer-fired single action with an under-barrel coil-type recoil spring and a leaf-style mainspring. It features a detachable box magazine, released by the thumb, just how Mae likes it. Disassembly was handled with a Glicenti-style cross key. The locking action was totally unique, relying on a tipping crossbar over the top of the gun. Now, I think you can tell just at a glance that this design does not meet all of those specifications. As a matter of fact, the 1 or 2 prototypes that were made, they were only chambered in 38. This thing did not hit the nail on the head for the British requirements. It seems to be more of a proof of concept. And it really didn't stay with the company that long. However, certain elements in this patent are very clearly precursors to this gun today. Now, before I go any further, I want to also make sure that we spell out sort of the atmosphere of that time for Webley, because in our last revolver episode, we just sort of ran through the revolvers. There was a lot to cover, but there's some company history that we didn't get to hit on, which is really Webley struggled throughout everything in order to stay ahead and to become the name that we recognize today. By 1903, we are through the Boer War and the government isn't snatching up any more revolvers. Plus, there is this whole Pistol Act thing. In 1903, the British domestic retailers, they were forced to start carrying a registry of any sold pistols. Now, all this meant was collecting some data about who was buying it and where they lived, and but you got to pen all this out by hand every time you sell a handgun, right? And it's a bother to the people that are buying it. It's a bother to the clerks who are doing it. It takes extra time in a sales environment when commission was common. And so why would you sell a handgun when you could sell a rifle, get the same margin, and do less work? You just give me money, you go buy. So they really kind of stopped pushing handguns, and this hurt the internal British handgun market. Add in our previously mentioned death of Thomas Webley, plus some good old McKinley tariffs, state factories competing for military contracts, and unlimited access by foreign manufacturers to the British market, and, well, it wasn't easy going for Webley and Scott. Also, while we're hovering in the year 1904, I would say that the new director of Webley and Scott, Frank Murray, would stop by the 1904 World's Fair. There he would meet with the leadership of Harrington and Richardson, and that would come in handy later in 1909. We are not going to cover the Harrington and Richardson copies of the Webley system that were made under license. That is a story for another day and a completely commercial story, but you should be aware that it's very possible that you're going to see guns that look just like ours today, marked H&R. Returning to Whiting's pistol work, still in 1904, he would dig in further. First, moving that magazine release to the heel. Among other small changes, we saw a big flip in the locking method. Instead of his novel concept, we are now over to a rising block. We've seen a lot of this sort of thing thanks to the C96, although this forward position is interesting. It also prevents the use of the coiled recoil spring under the barrel as before, so where to put it? I'm happy to say that our gun today uses the nearly same mechanism, although it's been sort of inverted. Let's just zoom in so you can get this concept, because it's pretty dang cool. All right, so we've got the gun. I'm going to take off my left grip panel so that you can see this. Now again, this is not the 1904 by a mile. There's a lot of changes to get here, and we're going to get to those. But just to see how this lever works, we have the slide, we have this lever arm, and we have this V spring. And this spring is powering that lever, which is powering the slide, which means that if I retract the slide, we'll see that that lever has cocked back and that spring's powering it forward. And then if we want to let her forward, without pinching myself, you can see that lever going forward. I'm sorry guys, I'm right-handed and this is a little tricky to just sort of show. Again, I don't want to get too deep into this gun, so let's go back to talking about that 1904. Another patent would follow late in the year, and the big change here is the addition of a hold-open mechanism, another requirement by the government. The follower engages a sear, pressing the hammer into the underside of the slide. Also of note, this is the first patent to show a rimless 455 cartridge. While you would think it's just rimless Mark II Webley, it is not. The 455 self-loader was developed from the Webley Fosbury's own big bore cartridge. Shortened up a bit, and with an extractor groove cut in, it is technically a semi-rimmed case. In September of 1904, a single prototype was shown over at Enfield, and it garnered a good bit of attention, but they wanted the trigger need to be smoothed out a bit and the grip angle could be just a bit better, so they went back, fixed those things, and then sent over more examples, and these garnered much more attention. After some basic testing, the government decided that they wanted a trial of this particular gun. It was found to be accurate, rapid firing, and handy. The recoil was improved over the service pistol as well. It passed endurance and sand tests, and the 3 noted jams were thought to be faults of the ammunition provided. So 10 pistols and 10,000 rounds were requested, although this was negotiated down to 5,000 rounds. Whiting wanted to make some final adjustments though, noting a few criticisms and wear on the demonstrated guns. He changed out the hammer hold open for a dedicated lever. Now pressing down on safety would release the slide. Other additions included an improved trigger disconnect and an automatic trigger block for when you're disassembling the pistol. Big trials began in May of 1905, and the results were ready in June. While the pistol was overall favorable, there were some big concerns. They did not care for the position and the ease of bumping the safety. It had some sensitivity to fine sand, the ejected casings were striking the shooters in the face, it had excessive recoil, and it was fairly much heavier than the current revolver. Interestingly, none of this was directed at the Webley itself. Instead, it was believed to be standard for all automatic pistols and a failing of the entire class of these arms, so they issued a blanket statement. The committee understands that there is no immediate prospect of an automatic pistol being required, and in the circumstances, they defer taking any further action for the present. So I'm sorry to say that was the death of the model 1904. There was just no want for that interesting handgun, and I'm going to say, probably for the best, that thing looks hecka awkward. But Webley's got all this time and money tied into what they're doing, and they need to cash in on some of this spent. Now Whiting, he wanted to keep going. He was like, no, I'm going to prove to them that they need a 4.55 automatic pistol. But cash, okay? Cash rules everything. And you can't design a pistol if you're going hungry and you can't afford spaghetti. So they had to go turn to the commercial market, and at this time, 1904, we all know what's going on. We are in the big crest of the pocket pistol 32 ACP fervor. They gotta get out some nice little handy gats. So they ditched the locking action, shrunk it all down, and came up with the model 1905. These guns would prove important to balancing the budget while the military self-loader concept soldiered on. They were modestly popular with some police orders and the like, but nothing for us to tie them to the later war. There were a number of variations following this series of pistols, but we're not going to bog down on the commercial 32s today. That is the place for you to do some nice old book reading. Interestingly, while tooling up for the 32 series, William Whiting would visit the US, and stopping by Colt, he had a chance to see their new locked breech experiments. This may have been an influence because in 1906, he was back at it. This time, he tried to reduce the pistol to the simplest possible components, which resulted in changes to the recoil lever and spring, simplified takedown button and stud, combination ejector and hold open device, an underside magazine release button, a manual safety taken from one of those 32 ACP guns that's fitted to the hammer, yada yada. But do you see that breech lock? Whiting drastically simplified and shrank the lock by having the barrel assembly act as the locking block, rising into a rectangular cut in the slide. That cut was the ejection port itself. This is frankly revolutionary, and this feature, combined with the Browning tipping barrel, is extremely common in compact handguns today. Of course, Whiting's barrel does not tip. It is guided by 45-degree angled projections in the frame and matching lugs on the barrel. Now, sadly, despite how advanced this handgun was, following the Boer War and with all the surplus in the market, there was no interest, and only 3 or so prototypes were made. So we're on a stall, and this happens a lot in the development of Webley. You see these numbers just sort of stack up and a few years go by, and it takes so long to leverage the ideas. Well, time would pass, we'd get into 1907, and the US pistol trials would show that there's some pretty good advancement going on, and maybe the British should pay attention. So they kicked that idea around for 2 years until 1909, when the chief inspector of small arms said, okay, maybe we should look at some autoloaders, maybe we should look at Webley, they're putting out some neat stuff. This may have been prompted by the factory sending over a sample of their 9mm military and police contract chaser. While these did see some foreign service, they are not, again, our topic today. But the 1909 contains a number of improvements that would be carried over to the 4.55 trials, because the British still wanted greater than .40 caliber. Most notably, the grip safety patented here would draw the attention of the Navy, although it did not impress the Army. I don't have a photo, but Whiting now had a 4.55 self-loader with simplified components, a sweet locking action, grip safety, and military dressing. So in September of 1909, Webley and Scott, along with Whiting, they had their chance to show off their pistol, and it would go to 3 locations. Enfield, Royal School of Musketry at Hythe, and over at Whale Island, courtesy of the HMS Excellent. Now, I'm going to tell you it was a panel of Army and Navy. The Army really didn't get all that enthralled, although we will see a very special model, the Royal Horse Artillery pistol. I am holding out hope that we will manage to get a hold of one of these rare and extremely valuable guns for our own demonstration, so I am not actually going to break down this model today. Instead, let's stick with the Navy and their further inspection of a gun much like this. After an initial look, they decided they wanted a lighter trigger, the safety to be moved around a bit, and the gun should be capable of single shots with the magazine in reserve. What? Okay, Webley meets all these requests and is back at it with a new gun in October. This time, the Navy goes to work. Only 9 stoppages in 1,254 rounds fired, and with only 1 broken part. And that problem was fixed in the manufacture going forward. The rest of the stoppages were from residue and bad primers. The gun fired fine following submergence in salt water. It was left to rust overnight in the rain, still fired fine. It was, however, 6.5 ounces heavier than the Webley revolver, but it boasted a possible 2 extra rounds. The takedown stud could use a bit of bolstering, and the sights could be a bit taller, but the safety and grip angle were great. Alright, you guys can see it's getting a little nuanced now, so I'm going to back off of this a bit and just say that another pro in the Webley's favor, or the self-loading Webley's favor, I guess it's up against its own, this is a weird competition, is that it was easier for novice shooters. They were more accurate if they were inexperienced shooters with this particular style of gun. The people who could shoot revolvers well found that it was fairly quick to adapt to this frame as well, and then they were shooting equally as accurately as they ever had with the revolver. So that means that this is really in a good position for training people quickly on a handgun that otherwise would have taken more time. It's much more natural of a shooter. And just as it was doing that well, I have to say a competitor entered the market and was pitted up against the Webley self-loader. That would be the Colt 1905 in .45 caliber. Oh boy. The comparison started in 1910. The Webley saw fewer stoppages and was deemed more accurate. It had better balance and heated up slower, reducing heat mirage on the sights. This was a product of the exposed barrel. The Colt was found to be lighter and simpler, with fewer coil springs, and those fewer parts meant easier manufacture. But the Colt had failed 12 out of 18 drop tests. The Webley, none. When both guns had their magazines dropped and stepped on, not stamped, the Webleys did not deform. After all the abuse, they were shot again for endurance. This time, the Colt's firing pin broke and it mag dumped. The Webley was just fine. So this is looking pretty good for an auto-loading handgun for the British Navy, right? Well, after all this, after all the praise that was heaped on this gun, there's still sort of a standing order of we're not interested in automatic handguns, so don't bother us. Which means that despite all this testing and the numbers and the blah, 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 the way that the committee approached the board was basically a memo that came down to the effect of, hey, does anybody want to look at semi-automatic handguns again? No? And then just silence, just no response to that. And so quietly, the gun was recommended for adoption, but this just went nowhere because no one was listening. Although eventually, someone seems to have cared, sort of. Winston Churchill rose to the First Lord of the Admiralty in late 1911 and began bullying for naval modernization. We also know that he had a fondness for the C-96 and trusted autoloaders, although I have not found a string that says he was definitely pushing the issue. His momentum carried through, and so experimental ideas like these were pushed back up to the top. I honestly believe that Webley and Scott were surprised to hear that that pistol was adopted in February of 1912. It had been on the back burner for so long. Even so, it wasn't meant to replace anything. It was just going to augment current inventory going forward. And I mean augment, not even replace. It's like we were going to buy a revolver, but now we're buying... No. It's just there for special instances. Although that would come in handy because of a new department. Also in 1912, the Royal Naval Air Service was formed, and their pilots and navigators would be among the first to receive the new handgun, with deliveries beginning in April of 1913. Woo! We made it to our handgun today. So I guess we could take a look, even though it had the most lackluster adoption ever. It's here. Let's look at it. So this is our big whopping handgun. And I got big hands, and this is a... Look, let me give you a comparison here. Here is a 1911, all right? I'll hold that up. It looks like it's smaller, right? Well, that's because this is in the foreground. Let's put it in the background. It hides a 1911. This is a big handgun. All right, so let me put that down and pick up my patented plastic. We do not have a manual safety. Instead, we just have the automatic. It's actually compressed at the moment. With the hammer back, it pops out. And that, we'll see in our animation, but that is our only safety device for the gun. Now, if I flip her around, we'll see that we have a slide release here. And on the underside, we have our magazine release button. So in order to get our mag out, we push that button. This mag has 2 positional notches. Remember, they wanted to be able to fire it singularly, which means just like that old Steyr Piper we saw in a previous episode, we can load to this point and then single load the gun. It'll lock open every time, and we can just throw another round in and then hit the slide release. And then fire that round and it'll lock open and yada yada. Or we can just pump this up and then we'll start shooting from our magazine again. This is a very odd thing on a rifle, let alone on a handgun. Woof. Single stack 4.55 magazine, very robust by comparison to other magazines of the day. These things are quite heavy. Now, the gun, in terms of lock open, by the way, you would expect that with the magazine out, like many other guns, that this would not do that. She does lock open even on empty. You always, or even without a magazine, if there's no next round, she's locking open, magazine or no. So you still have to use your slide release. All right, we've got some adjustable dovetail rear sight. We've got our exposed barrel to help with cooling. It gives us this very unique blocky shape. But in terms of other features, we still need to talk about the novel disassembly and show you how this lockup really works in person. So if I push this little button here, there, and just retract the slide a little bit rather and push that little button. So retract a little bit, push the button, let it forward, all right? Now we release the pressure on this cross pin, so I can just poke that. Cross pin comes all the way out. It is captive so that it cannot be lost. So when we're disassembling this, we don't have parts laying around. With it all the way out, and you got to tug it all the way out, you can then retract the slide further than you normally would. This exposes the entire top of the barrel, which means that I can now lift the barrel, and boy, this is smooth as all get out, right out. And you can see that we have 4, 1, 2, 3-4 lugs that operate inside of grooves in the frame in order to lift this barrel up, where the top portion of which, right there, locks into this opening, and that is the ejector port. So that is our locking system. It's just this 45-degree angle. This port serves as lock. This is a very, very modern concept, and we see this all the time today. Not on a 45-degree angle with these big flat millings, but usually with tipping barrels. Still, same effect, beautiful locking service. So while I get this back together, you guys can go over and enjoy an animation on just how all of this plays together. Just like any other semi-automatic pistol, we're going to load up our magazine and rack that slide. Now overall, this is a single-action hammer-fired system, but let's get into the details. For starters, here's that recoil lever, powered by a V-spring. And who can forget that locking action? Remember, those 45-degree angled grooves and lugs drive that block up into the top of the slide, locking on the ejection port. When fired, it's retracted down, freeing the slide to travel independently. The grip safety is the only one on this gun. Alright, I think we got the basics covered, so let's get this thing over to Mae.
From the trenches, the boys are calling to the man who stays at home. Why aren't you in the fighting line? It's your job as well as mine. If country is cold, won't wake them. It's the country's right to take them. For we've got to smash them. We want kills and we want guns, and men to them and to make them. We must all some don't care, well that's not fair. Every man must do his share.
What a fantastically weird thing to see on the range. Also, this gun's a little odd. Now, these guys were ordered with a first contract of 1,000, and then 2,500 would follow a year. This was not a large-scale production piece, and they really didn't fill up the inventory for the British. I will say the Australians did order 520 or so there's that. It's just not the most common sight on the battlefield. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in the time it took for this to go from recommendation to actual adoption, the competition had caught up. The Colt 1911 would be trialed just 4 months after the adoption of the Webley self-loader and proved to be about an even match. But it was cheaper, slightly more compact, or at least certainly less snaggy, and capable of being chambered for the same cartridge. And so the government wavered on buying many more of these things. They thought about it, and they were looking at the Colt, and then war were declared. At first, Webley would scramble to produce both these and the revolvers, but as the war went on and it became more focused on attrition and just get what you can get out, special ammo, special needs, these things dwindled to practically non-production. A few were assembled here and there, a few parts manufactured here and there, but no, we went right back, well, they went right back over to revolver production. They were cranking out this, the Mark VI big boy that we talked about last episode. This is where all the attention was. Commercial sales would also continue, but realistically, they never depleted their entire inventory, mostly because the dang things were so expensive. The government paid £3 9 shillings. On the private sales side, these guns were billed as the high-velocity military automatic and were £4 6 shillings, a steep price that limited commercial sales in 1914 to only 393 units. Heck, by the end of World War I, there were way more of these Colt 1911s than there were of the Webley self-loaders in British hands. And so, it really didn't stay an iconic handgun, although we certainly recognize them because nothing looks like that. Now, I wish I could say that they were stellar in battle, that the one thing that was going for it is that nothing could touch this particular handgun when used in conflict, but the reality is they didn't see a lot of conflict. Only 7,500 made for the war. That's a drop in the bucket, number one, but number two, they were going only to like the Navy. And so for them to get on land and to get in combat, they had to come through with a naval division or a Marine battalion. These people did show up to things like Antwerp and Gallipoli, and in that way, these things filtered into the front lines. I don't have to tell you that neither of these campaigns went all that well. So the Webleys got to fight, but I don't know of any personal accounts of anyone saying they really quite liked theirs. And we do know that they noticed one fatal flaw. Remember, I showed you that large bearing surface with all those 4 lugs in there. That is a lot of surface area inside this gun. And if fine mud, wet, fine mud gets down in there, they tend to jam up because there's just no room. There's no loose tolerance in there. And so while a beautifully polished handgun, when dry or even just plain wet, with fine mess, she's no good. And so you had to keep this thing real clean to keep her running, which is an obvious challenge in trench conditions. Post-war, I'm sorry to say that there would be no more of these ordered for the military. And yes, they would continue to produce them commercially and refocus especially on the .32 ACP market, but because of the standing inventory, they did not want to waste. And in doing so, they pushed the current designs ahead of developing new ones. And also there's kind of a reason they didn't get too many new designs. Get there in just a moment. Not having new designs, forcing the old ones through, and in an environment where a lot of people aren't looking for firearms, and when they are, there's plenty of surplus firearms, Webley did not stand out in the pack. And so when we see a lot of these 32s that we think of, 380s that we think of from the 20s and 30s, these real popular designs, the rise of Walter and things like that, well, we don't think of Webley. They rested on their laurels. And they were further hurt by the Firearms Act of 1920, which again suppressed the domestic British market. And at this time, Whiting chose to finally retire. He had already lost 2 of his 3 sons in the war, and the third one only survived because he worked at the factory and couldn't be shipped off. It shook his passion for his work, and so his retirement was not unexpected. Sadly, he wouldn't even get to enjoy that because he would succumb to a diabetic coma and pass away in 1924. His pistol did manage one last gasp of 1,000 units sold to the South African Union Defense Force. This is the model 1922 in 9mm. The big boys, well, they saw commercial production in very small batches until 1933, and the last of the sales probably went out the door around 1937. It never quite made the huge impression they were hoping for, I'm really sorry to say. Now, the 4.55 self-loader cartridge, well, that had already been declared obsolete in 1921 by the British government, so this thing was really just nowhere to be found, except for in inventory. They did box them up and keep them. They weren't surplused right away. And that proved to be a good thing because they were pulled right back off the shelves for the second showdown. Mostly they were issued to the Fleet Air Arm, and ammunition was also produced again for both these and the on-hand 1911s. But it was again declared obsolete in 1947. Also, it's kind of tragically funny, but at the beginning of World War II, Webley and Scott rode over to the naval authorities and said, hey, we still have a big pile of parts for this particular handgun, and you still have some in inventory. I know they're not popular, but would you like the parts? Because some of them probably need them. And the naval authorities said, nah, we're fine, and we're not really worried about that gun. And so Webley and Scott melted down all the parts for scrap. And a month later, the Admiralty said, hey, by the way, we could use some spare parts. Could you write us up an invoice for that? That's just money and material wasted down the drain. I would have held on to it for another 6 months, but hey, who am I? Anyway, that sort of wraps up the lackluster history of what is probably what I think one of the most fascinating guns of the war. I mean, this thing is terrifically interesting. It's massive. It's certainly functional, although it looks like it's out of another dimension. It looks like somebody's kid in a kindergarten class drew a gun. It's got a barrel and a blocky thing here, and a little hammer on the back, and it's shaped like an L. This is cartoonish, but it doesn't feel bad. I actually like the grip. I mean, it sticks out beyond my big meaty mitt. But it's not up to me. I'm the wrong size. So let's get this over to Mae and get her opinion. Well, even after last episode, we are still gluttons for punishment, so we are going to let Mae touch yet another British gun and see if she destroys all of your hopes and dreams.
Oh, crikey is what I'm supposed to yell instead, right?
Let's not get more hate mail. All right, so this is the Webley self-loader, as you've probably been aware of for the past minimum half hour. I don't know how long this episode's going to be.
God, I hope they haven't skipped ahead, otherwise this gets real confusing.
I think there were more pages in this than the Luger. Anyway, here's the Webley self-loader.
Thank you.
And we don't have anything else, so we can go more traditional with our format. Would you walk us through the ergonomics?
Okay. First impressions handed this gun. It is big. It is bulky. It is very weird looking, but I mean, like, it just basically looks like someone took a rectangle and another rectangle, stuck them together, and put a little barrel up front. This is the simplest idea of gun, I guess, as far as look goes to me. Like, if I were young, like, I thought of what a gun looks like, this is exactly what I would see. That's just... And then the size of this thing, it's got a lot of girth to it. Honestly, it kind of reminds me of the Roth Karenka a little bit in terms of that size, but it's not uncomfortable, surprisingly enough. Like, I expected when I was first handed this guy this to be one of the most uncomfortable grips to handle. And you know, first putting it in your hand, it's not bad. It actually is still pretty comfy. The grip's at an alright angle. And weirdly enough, the safety back here has a decent swoop that goes into your hand. So it's actually pretty good. I kind of like it. Now the safety, I do feel like because it's the entire web of your hand, it does kind of feel, I don't know, like it's not quite as solid as it is with just a simple like back safety that they usually put on there. It's kind of mushy a little bit, but it's still not uncomfortable. Like, I don't really feel like I have to death grip this guy. It feels like my grip's a little bit softer in the back, I guess, than what I was anticipating, but still not bad. Manipulating the, oh my God. Wait, there we go. Manipulating the slide. Not bad. It is stiff, don't get me wrong, like, but I feel like I can do this all day once I get a good grip on it. It's got good serrations back here for me to be able to get a purchase on it. It's not bad. It's a little stiff, but I don't feel like I have that much of a problem with it, honestly. Okay, mag release. Push button, awesome. On the heel. Why? I feel like, why? On earlier models, they showed one right here. Why? Like, what is this? I mean, it works. And I mean, you can pop it out, which is great. So why put it it's like they're teasing me. Okay, so putting the safety in. All right, I've got my safety in. Or, I've got the mag in. Wait, no, it's not all the way in. If I just want to shoot one round, there it is. It's a little bit confusing and completely unnecessary that they have it set up that you, like, just have one shot. You're only able to put one round off, that you have to pop the mag all the way in. That's a little bit weird to still have this when you're going into battle. Like, it doesn't seem like a battle-ready, war-ready type of gun in my mind. Like, I just don't see that as a necessary thing in battle. Target shooting, sure. Battle, not really. Can't understand why that would be necessary. The sights, you know what? These are actually pretty tall. These are, I would argue, pretty fantastic sights. Like, I really feel like when I point, they line up pretty quickly, and they're nice. I actually like them a lot. So props, guys, for the sights. You know what? That's pretty much for ergonomics, aside from, I guess, just the slide release. Positive, easy to use. Although I will say it kind of, at one point, just because of where it's located and me having shot modern guns before and other guns that happen to put the mag release up here, kind of made me feel like it was going to be a mag release at some point. No, it never is. It never will be. Not with guns, because, of course, back then they were never doing this. They were always doing heel releases. Why? But you know what? For ergonomics goes, it was a very unique experience. Very unique gun.
I'm beginning to be terrified by the idea of making any more of these episodes, because somebody is starting to develop a complex. Now, if I may.
You may.
Thank you. We don't keep ammo anywhere near the set.
Oh, that's so mean. Come on.
This gun is definitely unusual. I would say that it is the retro Glock. It's just the shape it needs to be. Very squared up feeling, very simple mechanism. It's got a lot going for it, but boy, is it kind of ugly as sin. I mean, you would think most utilitarian handgun you've ever seen, and then you get a hold of it, and it should be hard steel. It should be all hard angles. It should be all terrible. I think we talked about the Savage back in there. We talked about how it felt organic.
Yeah.
This doesn't feel organic. I can't go that far. It's actually still one of the more square guns we've shot. When I hold it, I can feel the corners. You know what I mean? I'm holding a rectangle. Not nearly as bad as I thought. I really thought I was going to get like just hard angles.
And then the weight on that guy, it's about the same weight as the revolvers, yet it doesn't really feel like there's much weight to it because all the weight's right there in your hand. Like there's barely anything in front of your hand.
That's true. As we extend this, pretty much everything here in front of my knuckles, there's not a lot of mass. So it's better distributed. I'd say a slight tendency to kind of kick up a bit.
We'll
but
get to that in the shooting section.
Okay, you're right. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of you. All right, well, why don't we go to the shooting segment? Would you like to walk us through what it's like to pull the trigger on a Webley self-loader?
Yeah, okay. So cover the sights, tall, good, decent. I thought they were perfect for on range. Racking slide, loading, all fine. Tank heel release. Pulling the trigger. Trigger's it's a little bit mushy and very short. Like it was unexpectedly short. And it's amazing that you could actually perceive the mushiness that comes through it, but you can because there's enough of it, which says something about how mushy it would be if it were a longer pull through. But, it's not great, I guess 4 or 5 out of 10, It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. It was just kind of like middle range. It wasn't my favorite. It was passable. Let's go with that. Passable trigger. The recoil. As Othais was trying to spoil it, all the weight's right here pretty much, which means it's kind of wanting to kick up every time when I'm shooting it, which don't get me wrong. The self-loader ammo was a good, strong cartridge. The problem was for this guy where the weight was distributed, it was just a bit much, and it did mean my reset time was kind of extended as a result of it. Definitely doable with this guy. I could handle it fine, but I do want to make sure I point that out to you guys because that's the point of this, trying to give you guys a full scope of these guns with my reviews. But you know what? Even that being said, I still shot all right with it. Like it wasn't, don't get me wrong, my grouping wasn't as tight as I would have liked it to be, but it was still decent. I would definitely say the sights and the grip definitely aided with that. Honestly, I would even argue potentially that short pull through with the trigger gave me less time of any potential shake or wobble that will come through with that. So overall, as a shooter goes, definitely a unique experience, still a comfortable shooter, just a little bit difficult to manage that excess recoil that comes from that short barrel.
I found the one thing shooting this gun, may I borrow that? Is despite the fact that she's light up front with a very large round, not the highest power, but a large mass throwing round. Mm-hmm. The one good thing that is despite the complete, the amount of mitt that I got going on right here, I still have probably 1/2 inch to almost 3/4 of an inch of grip sticking out below, which means, and again, we assume shooting one-handed because World War I. I know I could shoot it two-handed and really torque down with my left hand.
I mean, I could do that too.
Yes, but regardless, with the longer grip, I feel like you have more chances to sort of pull her back in with your pinky. You get full leverage on the grip, which is nice. But I agree, it still tends to want to walk up. And it kind of is weird, but like she was saying with this sort of, the fact that the grip safety rides your whole hand down into your palm, it feels like the gun's wiggling when you shoot it.
Just a little bit. It's not even like you really necessarily perceive it. It's like after you finish shooting, you're like, was there something there that I missed?
Well, hammer down, that grip safety is pretty much stuck to the gun. It's got maybe like a centimeter of play. And so it feels like a firm thing. And I guess if I had this sort of recoiling, it would feel pretty firm. The problem is once the hammer goes back and the gun rocks forward, as it rocks forward, that guy opens up and it's pressing back into your grip. And now your grip is resting on a spring attached to the gun, not on the gun itself, unless you keep sort of squeezing in. And you do, don't get me wrong, I don't know how to explain it. You really have to handle one of these guys to get the experience. It's this sort of loose, wiggly squirrel feeling.
It's a very faint feeling, though. I will give it that. Like, it's not incredibly perceivable.
No, I don't feel like I'm going to lose control of the gun. It's just an odd... I would compare it not in the sense of how it actually feels, but if you shot like an Auto 5, like a long recoil shotgun, and there's that double hump sensation, it doesn't make it hard to control the gun. It's just different. Well, it's not a double hump, but it's just different.
Yeah.
Anyway, with all that said, would you take something like this into the trenches in World War I?
Okay. So let me go through this a little bit. I have heard that these guys don't do so well if they get a little dirty, so if little motor muck gets in there, it makes me a little bit nervous that it wouldn't perform great. So, okay, sure, I keep it clean. All right, that'll be all right. You know what? Even that being said, I'd probably end up getting this one a decent yes. If only because, especially if I were like a cavalryman or something like that, and I had this guy on my hip, I really don't have to guess where I'm gripping. It's a big, bulky gun. I can pick it up. It's a good point shooter, like tall sights. It's great for that. I don't want to give it a fantastic yes or my full support behind it because I feel like, one, with that mud and muck issue potentially, and two, I've only got 7 rounds. Look how big this guy is. I mean, I feel like for the fact that I'm only getting 7 rounds with how long that grip is with that mag in there, I'm getting ripped off. Like, I feel like I should at least have 10 minimum. But no, it's giving me is 7. It's kind of ridiculous for this bulk. But honestly, you know what? I still perform well with it. I was certainly more confident when I was with the revolvers. I wish I had more rounds. I wish that it was a little more reliable when it came to any wear, tear, or like roughing it in the trenches kind of style. I don't know, maybe work on that trigger a little bit. But overall, I still shot well with it. I still enjoyed it as a shooter, and I just kind of liked it. So I guess that's why it's getting a better rating than maybe I normally might give something, potentially with those little snags that could have. But you know what? I still had a nice time with it. So yeah, I'm going to give this one a decent yes.
Well, I appreciate the perspective. For me, the Webley self-loader is certainly interesting. I don't know that I want to bet my life on one, especially with comparisons.
Come on!
To be fair, I'm also biased because it took us a while to work up a load that was really reliable with this gun.
That was the ammo, though. The gun was actually, once we got the ammo to spec, and it performed beautifully.
I don't know. There's just something that I can't imagine going, yeah, I don't want to die. I better bank it all on this.
You just don't like it because it looks like a drawing of a gun, like a 5-year-old drew it.
All right. But anyway, we will have to disagree on this one. And, of course, irritate somebody somewhere. So, with that wrapped up, I'm going to thank you all for tuning in, ask you to check for any updates after the credits, and have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
Hey everyone, this is really fast because Mae and I are soaked in gasoline. I'm trying desperately to get a horizontally opposed 4-cylinder carburetor to agree after the 3rd time pulling it out of the bike. Anyway, the reason I'm in a hurry to do that is because, good lord, you can see me editing. The reason I'm in a hurry to do that is because we are now officially slammed. I'm trying to write about 6 additional scripts between now and the middle of November so that we can go film a big batch of machine guns for all of you to enjoy, and I have to know what I'm talking about before I get there. So, if you need help with anything, including t-shirt orders and things like that, of course email me. Please do forgive me if I'm a little slow. Alright, have a good one. Bye.